Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the Canadian Psychological Association and its executive for the honor that you bestowed upon me. I appreciate the fact that this honor is one that goes to the person of the year whose contribution to humanitarianism is acknowledged by the association, and I am deeply honored that you've considered me in that category. I want to also acknowledge the work that the Canadian Psychological Association does to understanding and contributing to the understanding of the significant impact that residential schools have had upon the lives of its survivors and the intergenerational population. And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about some of the things that I think the association could do to continue its work in a way that contributes to the process of reconciliation. As you know, Indian residential schools were established shortly after Confederation and were with us for about 130 years. For 7 generations, the Government of Canada forcibly removed children from their families, from their mothers, from their fathers, at very tender ages. Children as young as 4 and 5 were taken and placed into institutions that were referred to as residential schools, for the purpose of educating them to be something that their families were not. They were educated to believe that they were inferior. They were educated to believe that their cultures, their languages, their families, their traditions, their own histories were irrelevant to the nation, and that therefore they needed to change and to begin to behave like and think like other members of society if they wanted to be able to get along. There was a belief in Canadian society in the 19th century that Indigenous people were on the verge of extinction and were going to disappear. And there was an obligation, it was felt, on the part of the government to save them from extinction, to allow them to be able to survive into the future. This was quite a Darwinian belief that was at play at the time. Inappropriate and, quite frankly, quite racist. But it was a commonly held belief around the world, and others in society believed even more fervently than that Indigenous people were a problem to Canadian society that needed to be solved. As a result of being taken away from their families and placed in residential schools, children suffered the emotional trauma of separation. In and of itself, that would have caused significant harm and damage to them. We know that. All of the current studies show the impact that that kind of separation without logic, without reasoning, without an appropriate support system put in place would cause great harm to young people. It certainly did cause emotional harm to the parents who were left behind. But for the children, being raised in an institution meant that they were being raised in an environment where love and understanding of family relationships, being able to function within a family environment, learning from brothers, from sisters, from aunties, from uncles, from other community members, being able to have a normal relationship with other people in the community was all taken away from them. Their understanding about who they were, their understanding about their own history, about who their heroes were, about their creation stories were all denied to them. Understanding about what would happen to them after they left this world was taken away from them. They had no ability to learn the teachings of their people. They did not know what their traditional names would have been. They didn't know the teachings around the name-giving ceremonies or the marriage ceremonies. They didn't know some very basic fundamental teachings about the various points in life and the importance of them and how to deal with the challenges of life with family supports. And as a result, being in the institutions caused them great harm, just in and of itself. But in addition to all of that, of course, we have now learned about the significant amount of physical, mental, and sexual abuse that occurred in the schools. And though not everybody in the schools was a victim of physical or sexual violence, our estimate is that probably 40 to 45% of children in the schools were victimized in that way. We believe that 100% of the children who were there were traumatized either by the direct experience of being abused or by living in fear of being abused. And when you live your life as a child in fear of potential violence coming to you in the middle of the night, then that does something to you as well. Those schools were in place, as I said, for 130 years, and they affected about 7 generations of children. If they had only been in place for 1 or 2 generations, then the children returning from the schools would have been able to be healed and helped by their elders, by their parents, using traditional means of dealing with trauma and impacts of violence, as Indigenous people had been doing for thousands of years, and doing it in a way that would have reinforced their sense of self and their identity. But instead, with each passing generation, when those children of the next generation returned, they would encounter people with whom they had no connection or little connection. They'd encounter people who had their own damages that they were having trouble coping with. And in addition to that, very little in terms of traditional means of coping. That meant that for 7 generations, this cycle of abuse and the impact of trauma repeated itself and magnified itself over that period of time. So that today, when we look around us, we see the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren of residential school survivors who are struggling with their sense of identity, who are struggling with trying to find a place for themselves, who are struggling still to come to terms with the fact that they either must live in the communities where they come from in order to be protected from the racism of the larger society. But in doing so, they must be prepared to experience the tremendous poverty and social dislocation that goes on in those communities. And so their options are limited, and their choices often are desperate. Those of you who practice in the field of psychology, I hope, can understand the amount of need that is out there on the part of those young people. They are literally crying out for help in the words that they use and the actions that they show. But in addition to that, through the actions of taking their own lives or threatening to take their own lives or attempting to take their own lives. That should be seen by us as a bellwether of the mental health of those young people. And we need to do what we can to help them. But we also need to understand that Western concepts of healing may not provide the solution that they need. They may need as well to understand who they are. They may need as well to understand what it means to be an Indigenous person in this society. They may need to understand where they belong as Indigenous people if they are to have hope. It's not just about healing from traditional mental health problems in a traditional mental health way. It's also about combining all of that with an understanding of this history in the context of the mental health problems that they will present to you given all of this history. I encourage all of you to learn more about the residential school system by referring to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We spent a lot of time documenting this, but we also spent a lot of time talking about what we think can be done to solve the legacies of residential schools. And you have a role to play, as do all Canadians, to ensure that if we are going to move forward in a proper way, that we will be able to help those young people find their identity, to find their sense of pride, to be able to stand up and talk from a position of self-respect so that they will be able to achieve reconciliation on behalf of themselves and their communities, which is a relationship of mutual respect with the rest of Canada. Thank you very much.